Good afternoon, welcome to another AP US History video with Mr. Pate. Today we're in review mode once again, and we're looking at foreign policy of the United States between Revolution and World War I. Okay, here we go. So we start out with, from the Revolution, a French alliance. This emerges in 1777 after the Battle of Saratoga. The French are U.S. allies. This does not end at the Treaty of Paris, but continues. And the French Revolution is going to break out in 1789. It's going to be this series of wars against Britain and other countries in Europe, going through much of the 1790s. And then in the early 1800s, you're going to have the Napoleonic Wars start. Well, actually, just before the 1800s begin. But what you're going to have is the United States is going to have this French alliance until the mid-1790s. And then really you have the state of hostility developing between the United States and France, and eventually John Adams is going to kind of sever this relationship and agree to be friends but not allies with the Convention of 1800. So the French alliance dies with the Federalist era. And from that time, really seeing that this isn't working before he leaves, Washington is going to make this a neutrality proclamation and not get involved in what's going on in Europe. And he, at his farewell address, is going to say, beware of peacetime alliances, basically, among other things. So he's going to be advocating for this thing we call today isolationism. The United States worrying about what's happening within the country, not worrying about what's happening outside the country. Now, before any of you question what I'm going to say here, I want you to keep in mind we'll define anything happening as isolationistic, happening within the United States, to the United States, or close to, like on the periphery, adjacent to the United States. We'll define intervention as involved in Asia or Europe, going there. And you're going to see the United States does not do that. So the United States, people continue to follow the precedent set by Washington and his warning and stay isolationistic. And this is really going to last from the late 1790s all the way until, well, 1914 and beyond with World War I. And the United States isn't in World War I in 1914, but it's going to get slowly sucked into the conflict with World War I with issues with Germany. So isolationism is a very long-running U.S. policy that's going on. Another thing going on during the same period of time, you're going to get the Monroe Doctrine. And this is going to be during the Monroe years. It's crafted by John Quincy Adams, issued during the era of good feelings, and it basically says the era of new colonization is over. Now you got two themes going on here. Theme number one is Washington, don't get involved in what's going on, worry about what's happening in your own country. Theme number two is going to be a separate thing. Theme number two is going to be, hey, we have this role of kind of protectors of democracy. You're going to see this come to a head with imperialism in a minute here. So the Monroe Doctrine, backed up by Great Britain, says the era of colonization is over. That doesn't mean get out of your existing colonies, but it means no new colonies. Okay, imperialism. Imperialism, quite simply, is this idea that's going to emerge, and it's going on already for other countries. The idea of having colonies and being an empire. And the United States, not really an empire. In 1867, Seward agrees to purchase Alaska. He's derided for it. Obviously, that's worked out pretty well for the United States with gold and oil, among other things. And natural treasures up there. But with imperialism, basically you're going to see that by the 1880s, people are starting to agitate saying, and bring up ideas saying, we need to develop an aggressive foreign policy to become a great country. By this time, the United States is the best industrial country in the world, largest output. So they're saying, some people are saying for business reasons, we need to go abroad. But there are other reasons too. Alfred Mahan is going to say that, you know what, we need to do this to become a world power, and you either become a world power or get left behind. And he's going to say, if we don't jump in now, other people will. We need a modern navy, we need an Isthmian Canal, which begins Panama Canal. We need to have island coaling stations for refueling for the navy, and we need to develop trade with foreign markets. And if we do all those things, the United States will become this great country. Okay, and of course we know the United States eventually does do basically everything in Mahan's prescription, which is why we still know about Mahan today. But he's not the extent of the pro-imperialism forces. You have businessmen saying, give us new markets. You have the yellow journalists that are pointing out things going on in Cuba and elsewhere, trying to draw America into the conflict. Another thing going on that's not totally coincidental, the end of the frontier is noted by historian Frederick Jackson Turner. And Jackson Turner is going to basically say, hey, by the 1890 census, there is no contiguous frontier line in the West. We have filled in the United States, which of course there was really more space, but basically there was not a frontier with the United States. And he said the implications of that changes what the American character is, and thus I wonder where we'll go next. And the going next becomes going abroad. So there are a lot of things going on in the United States, and you start having more and more people discussing this idea of should the United States become an imperial power. But not everybody's on board. And you see these symptoms as the United States gets drawn into the Spanish-American War. There's a resistance to imperialism. You have an anti-imperialism league that forms and grows in clout and voice throughout the 1890s, really hits their zenith in the 1898 Philippine annexation debate. And drew together all kinds of random people from society into the Anti-Imperialism League. I mean, you had union leaders, and you had Andrew Carnegie, and all kinds of different voices there saying, don't do it. The Teller Amendment. Now, this is really telling. It's a bad pun, I suppose. What's telling about the Teller Amendment, though, is the United States, at the time they declare war, remember, they think the USS Maine has been hit by a Spanish mine, and there's the mistreatment of the Cubans by the Spanish, and so Americans start to get more fired up. There's the Delome letter. The Americans start to get more fired up for war. At the time Congress gives a declaration of war, they still say, Teller Amendment, no U.S. taking over of Cuba. Cuba will be left to its own people to rule. Now that's holding to these kind of same principles of foreign policy of the Monroe Doctrine. You know what? We want to spread democracy. And Americans have believed this for a long time. Manifest destiny. We're going to spread our awesome civilization abroad. Sea to shining sea. We have democracy. We have an advanced culture, an educated population, on and on and on. Some people use that as a justification for the Mexican-American War and just getting as much land as you could. Obviously, there's other motivations going on there too. But the Teller Amendment is still a renunciation of imperialism, even though the U.S. is going to war. Well, the United States is going to quickly take Hawaii, which up until the Spanish-American War, Hawaii had been sitting there for years, and Grover Cleveland had never taken it, so it's still just waiting. Okay? So Hawaii, up until the Spanish-American War, and the Teller Amendment upon the declaration of war, are telling that Americans are not fully on board with this idea of getting involved elsewhere, intervention. They're not invested in becoming an imperial country, so you have a split country. Well, with the Spanish-American War, things quickly change. Number one, they're going to annex Hawaii. Okay, that happens very quickly by McKinley. After very vigorous debate, eventually the United States annexes the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and part of this is just the completely one-sided nature of the war. But then you're going to see a reversal here. This is right when the war begins, and very shortly you get the Platt Amendment saying the U.S. will intervene in Cuba if necessary, and will keep Guantanamo Bay as a military base for the Navy. Okay, so post-war changes leading us toward World War I, kind of our end point for this video. Post-war changes. If you look at what happens here with these three things, a much more aggressive kind of imperialistic stance that once this Philippine debate is over, it seems like America just swings toward imperialism and more world intervention and trying to be a little bit more of a world power. You have the open door, trying to gain the markets in China. The United States will end up committing troops after the Boxer Rebellion and forcing the door open for U.S. trade, even though it's late to the party. Panama Canal. TR is going to support and encourage a Panamanian revolution and help basically the United States be able to build this canal. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, okay? Now kind of an echo of it. Instead of it's just the era of colonization is over as a warning, now this is the United States will intervene where necessary. And you're going to see, so this is a much more involved, a broad stance. And this is not all just upon the U.S. borders. These are, stances with China, with different parts of Latin America far from the U.S. border. Big stick diplomacy comes along with the Roosevelt corollary, this willingness of the U.S. to be involved. Dollar diplomacy, the U.S. foreign policy can be influenced to support trade and business interests abroad. moral diplomacy, Wilson's efforts to, for humanitarian reasons, get involved. This is kind of almost nation building like you see the United States doing in the 1990s under Clinton and 2000s under W. Bush. This kind of will get involved to restore, help rebuild nations in different places. And then you, of course, get to World War I while moral diplomacy is still going on. And, again, you see this kind of collision of the U.S. values, which are still there, U.S. values of the Monroe Doctrine, resistance to imperialism, and then there's still kind of here in some ways saying the United States should be a force for good in the world. Now, we're not going to argue the United States has been a force for good in every way, in every situation of all time, but I think if you put it on a scale compared to the rest of the world, generally it has been quite a force for good in most situations. Why does the United States get involved in World War I? Wilson is willing to go in after campaigning on not going in because he says we have a chance to end war, to come up with this permanent peace organization. We have a chance to have a spot at the table to help fix things so there aren't future wars. Pretty good idealistic ideas, even though they don't work out with the League of Nations at this time. Our next video in the review will talk about U.S. foreign policy after World War I, but that's all the time we have for today. Stay classy, Apewish.